Good evening, fellow listeners, and welcome to Feed the Dark podcast. If you're not watching and only listening, you should know that I'm playing with an evil ash puppet because I'm an almost 30-year-old man, and that is what adults do, but that's not what I'm really here to do. I mean, I could play with my Evil Dead toys all night, and trust me, I could do that for an entire episode. But what I really want to do is talk about one of my favorite horror novels that I've read in the past year or so. One that has stuck with me more than most. And that is Carrion Comfort by Dan Simmons. Now this one really took me by surprise, and I cannot wait to talk about this thing. It is lengthy, it has incredibly small text, and it is 767 pages long, although that is deceiving. It's really well over 1,000 pages. It is a massive investment, but I will tell you why it is entirely worth your time. So before I get into that and what I love so much about it, I should get into the characters and the story of the book. So the book consists of a few main characters. It is not exactly a character study. It's a story involving the characters Saul Lesky, who is a Jewish man who is a wiser, educated person who has endured one hell of a travesty throughout the Holocaust, which comes into a major play in this book. The sheriff, Bobby Joe Gentry, who is just this wisecracking but not stupid white man in the novel, who has many amazing one-liners. And one of the main characters, Natalie Preston, who is a extremely strong black woman who comes into play after a major horrific event happens. The villains of this book are, brace yourself, psychic vampires. I know what you're thinking. That sounds really silly, and you've probably seen similar vampires or similar characters such as this in other cheesy horror video games or other cheesy horror books. I know that, people had problems with this in Doctor Sleep. I personally love Doctor Sleep, but how they are portrayed in Carrion Comfort is much more mature than how they were portrayed in Doctor Sleep. So this book actually didn't really expect to scare me. And to be honest, the reason why I want to talk about this first and why this interests me more than most other books is because this is very unique in that it didn't scare me while I was reading it at all. And I really didn't expect it to. So I read the back of this, and it seemed like a cool idea. Like there were psychic vampires who existed throughout history, who existed in the time of the Holocaust, who existed in times of different murders, like the JFK assassination and other various historical events, and it had an effect on various historical atrocities and current. Listen, this is going to make me sound a little silly, but because of the length of a novel, once again, it's well over 700 pages. It has a vast amount of characters. Usually, those types of books don't necessarily scare me. I have no problems with epics at all, whether they be epic films or epic novels. They are some of my favorites. I mean, Lawrence of Arabia I love 2001: A Space Odyssey. I am not one for a low attention span. But when it comes to horror, my most beloved genre, to keep me scared and to keep me on edge, usually when it exceeds that length, it gets kind of into It territory. Now, I know that It is an incredibly, famous, beloved Stephen King book. What I mean by It territory is that it starts out scary, and then it gets intriguing, maybe because of the characters, or maybe because of how the story progresses, but it doesn't necessarily still scare me. This is probably the longest story that I've ever read that actually scares the shit out of me. It had an after effect. I know I mentioned this before, but it's really worth mentioning that this really creeped me out the more I thought about it. And if you're a history buff, this is really one of the books for you. And I hear about the terror of another book by Dan Simmons that is just a treat for fans of history. So the reason why the psychic vampires in this novel are so much different than anything I've ever read before is because of the metaphor that he uses, the villains in his novel. So the villains in his novel are characters named Will Borden. He is a Nazi. Well, a Nazi that has now woven his way into Natural Society. There is Tony Harrod, who is a Hollywood producer, a bit younger, but this really becomes relevant more so today than I think even back then. There is Melanie Fuller, who is a psychic vampire, a beast of her own, who, without spoiling anything, becomes just a massive threat to entire towns around her. But the entire metaphor that Dan Simmons uses for how psychic vampires take over someone it's a metaphor for rape. More so, it's a description of when a psychic vampire takes over your body. Dan Simmons is very smart in that he more so describes the feeling of what it is like to lose one's autonomy and to be submissive and to just lose that self. How he describes it is honestly quite disturbing because, once again, it is a metaphor for rape. And it happens quite often because those are the villains throughout the novel. It is an intensely mature analysis of what rape is, and he drags that metaphor into other genocides, more specifically the Holocaust, only because that's what they focus on here. Right? They also talk about slavery, and they talk about some other things as well. But it really makes you think about how oppressors view certain situations and how it feels to be oppressed. For instance, there are moments where you get the perspective of characters such as Tony Harrod and other psychic vampires, the power they feel from that. So you get the perspective of the quote-unquote rapist, but it is not from a sympathetic point of view, which would be completely irresponsible, but it's from a more realistic analysis. And once again, this was written in 1989 by a man. So to me, I just feel like it's an incredibly mature interpretation of history. And to be written in the late 80s with this level of maturity is just astonishing. And really, I mean, it's really one of the reasons why it scared me. So I should go into read the reasons why it didn't scare me while reading it, and it took a little longer. So this novel has, without giving anything away, several action sequences, because the psychic vampires take over many different people to the point of where sections in this novel feel more like giant action pieces. Not like Michael Bay, like we're not dumb. They're incredibly well written, and it's very smart how each characters take over different people and what people they take over and how they take over different people in the town. But for basically giant blockbuster set pieces. So for me, while reading this, I was like, this is really cool. I don't know if I totally understand why this is like listed on, one of the top horror books. It's cool. There's, destruction and a lot of people dying, and, there's a lot of plot, there's a lot of backstory, there's all that. It takes an incredible amount of patience. This is one of the few novels of this length that I would absolutely recommend to any horror fan, but not only any horror fan. Honestly, I would recommend this book to my father, who hates horror, who just likes history, who just likes to read books. I think this is just a fascinating analysis of several different essential topics. This is a novel that could bring about very important conversations, no matter if you're into horror or not. I feel like it's just one of those books that surpasses the genre in that way, which is why I wanted this to be the first book that I talked about. To Dan Simmons fans, I know that apparently his later novels are more well-written. I'm aware of that. I've read that online before. I ordered Summer of Night. It's in Amazon Prime, which means it'll be here tomorrow. I will read that very shortly, and I'll talk about that as well. And I acknowledge that he wrote this when he was younger and while he was teaching, and, apparently it's one of his lesser works. But to me, that is astonishing, because if this is one of his lesser works, I mean, this made my top 10 scariest books of all time. For me, I'm a man who's afraid of ghosts, and this is about psychic vampires. This is basically a fantasy novel that encompasses history. This shouldn't be scary. By all my criteria, this should just be like a fun, kind of cool horror book, but it's not. And on top of that, all the characters are really, really feel like people. It's pretty amazing that one person wrote all of these people. And before I even go more into this, I should say that Sheriff Gentry, who is the white sheriff of the town, he has one of my favorite lines in any horror book ever, because it's like 50 pages in, and some shit has happened, but not enough where, normally the characters would be like, all right, now is the time to act. Usually that's towards the end of the book. But this character, and I'm paraphrasing because I forgot exactly what this was. This character has a certain event explained to him after the very first event that takes over one of the towns. And he's like, "All right, yeah, they're psychic vampires. Let's go." Natalie and Saul are like, "Wait, what?" And Saul has a history with them, so this is why he is aware of his whole situation. It's like, "Wait, you're just you believe us?" And he's like, "Yeah, no, I hate movies where it takes them 90 freaking minutes to admit that there are actually vampires that exist in the world, and then they have to take care of it. No. I'm just accepting this. Let's do it." I love that. And I immediately shut my book, put my bookmark in, and I texted all my friends like, "This is awesome! I can't believe it!" Like the fact that Dan Simmons had the guts. Like I loved it. That was one of my favorite moments in like anything that I've read in recent memory. That was awesome. So another thing I really wanted to talk about is, I know I touched upon this before, but it was shocking that this was actually scary to me because of the action set pieces, but I really should go more into this because I've read several novels recently. One was Come Closer, which I adore, and Heart-Shaped Box, which scared the hell out of me. It just illuminated how differently this book was written than any other horror book that I've read, because there was no creaking on the wood panels and hearing like voices like kind of whispering. It was none of that. There was none of any of that shit. I mean, once again, I love Heart-Shaped Box and I love Come Closer. They're actually a little bit scarier to me. But the fact that Dan Simmons managed to basically write an epic action set piece and have that be like in my top 5 scariest novels of all time makes it probably the most unique novel in my top 5 scariest horror novels. This book rules. I am trying very hard not to spoil it. I will say one small spoiler because I think it's very interesting. There's a human chess game that gets played. I think that's an incredibly intelligent imagery for the rest of history and how people in power view people who are in the lower class throughout history, whether they were, black or Jewish or Hispanic or wherever they were in the world, whatever minority group they were, and whether they were women who had no control over their body for generations. And once again, the fact that this was written in the 80s by a man is astonishing to me. The incredible imagery and the vivid descriptions have stuck with me more so than any other book. I mean, there are a few other books that have scared me more, and there are a couple other books that I like more than this, like, Frankenstein and Dracula, and we'll get into that later for reasons. But no other book has kind of tricked me into liking it over time. Like, I read this book over the past summer. It is now March. It took me a few months to really, like, sit back and think, like, wait a minute, that is, like, Carrion Comfort really explained just current events as well as history better than any book I've ever read. And I don't want to give you the wrong impression. This is not nice. It's not an exact historical representation of a Holocaust. It's not an exact historical representation of slavery. It's not an exact historical representation of any assassinations or real-life murders that have happened throughout history. But just the metaphor that it uses and how it takes this fantasy concept is the clearest way to understand how people in power view themselves and how victims of, whether it's genocide or whether it's people enslaved, people who are a minority class, how they feel this is probably, honestly, and I know this sounds hyperbolic, but I promise you it isn't, this might be the greatest interpretation that I have personally read and the greatest illustration of that dichotomy. I cannot give us higher praise. I mean, this is one of my favorite novels in any genre that I have ever read. I know people be like, "Oh, what about Moby Dick or what about Hemingway or any of that?" Honestly, for me, I view this as a modern classic, and I would give this an 11 out of 10 if I could. I'm pretty amazed that Dan Simmons fans rate this relatively lower. From what I've seen online, maybe not in general, but from the online community, I'm almost nervous to read his later work because either A, I'll just vehemently disagree with all of you guys, or B, I won't like any more books. Like, if anything's better than Carrion Comfort to that degree that you people are saying online, then what the fuck else am I going to read after this? I mean, there's nowhere to go. And I read a lot, but this is like, once again, to me, this is one of my favorite books of all time. I like it the more I think about it. Every month that passes, I think about this book more. And even for my favorite books of all time, like Dracula or Frankenstein or The Shining or something like that, even those novels I've pretty much liked at the same level my whole life. I've never grown in less than a year to appreciate a work of fiction like I have Carrion Comfort. And I give it my highest recommendation. Once again, thank you guys so much for tuning in to Feed the Dark podcast. You could find me on YouTube. Pretty soon you could find me on Spotify and Apple Music and Libsyn. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it, guys, and I can't wait to see you next time.